the most beautiful land human eyes have ever seen. That's how Christopher Columbus described Cuba in 1492. But since then, this island paradise has faced exploitation, cruelty, tyrants, and dictators. Century upon century of injustices and repression up until today.
Right now, Cuba's falling down a bottomless pit.
Cubans say that Cuba is a pregnant, barefoot woman who is isolated by her husband, and that is this tyrannical state.
When you consider that more than 70% of the population's only dream today is to leave the country and go live abroad, you realize they've lost all hope.
But what happened in the 20th century that left Cuba in this situation? Part 1, from one empire's control to another. In 1898, Cuba won its independence from a dying Spanish empire. Many Cubans were ready for freedom and democracy. But after Spain lost the Spanish-American War in the same year, the United States turned independent Cuba into its satellite. The US built a naval base in Guantanamo Bay, and in 1903, the land was leased to the US permanently. The US created not just military ties, but economic ones too. It became the biggest buyer of Cuba's main product, sugar. The sugar industry made Cuba's wealthy class even richer, but people in the countryside struggled in poverty. The ruling class basically ignored them because it was more interested in its own power struggles. After decades of political instability, in 1940, a colonel named Fulgencio Batista won the elections. He wanted to stay in power, but a second consecutive term was forbidden by the Cuban Constitution, so Batista left politics in 1948, but not for long. He realized he wouldn't regain power in a vote, so he took it back by force in 1952.
Batista stages a coup d'etat that shatters all democratic hope in Cuba, an island that believed in its imperfect democracy, but did believe in democracy. That's the moment when Castro realizes that he can become the face of the opposition.
At that time, a young lawyer named Fidel Castro was planning on running for office. But because of the coup, there were no elections. As a student, Castro had been accused of getting involved in violent clashes between radical student groups. But he later joined the Orthodox Party, a more moderate leftist nationalist group. Not at all communist, by the way. Now, Batista's new government quickly was recognized by the US, the UK, and other countries after it declared itself anti-communist. International tourists flocked to Havana and other Cuban cities to visit casinos, which were controlled by the mafia. That created an image of prosperity, which masked the rampant poverty of the countryside. Meanwhile, Batista's regime was cracking down on the entire political opposition. Secret police committed torture and extrajudicial killings. Corpses of young dissidents were put on display on the streets where they'd lived to intimidate people. But terror, together with widespread corruption, made the opposition even more determined to overthrow Batista.
There were groups and factions coming from different social classes, with different political orientations and different strategies. There were students, there were former and current politicians, judges, lawyers, and intellectuals linked to the dominant parties before Batista's coup d'etat.
And that community would become really the backbone of the protest movements against Batista. Now, what did Fidel do to try to garner himself attention and gain legitimacy? He launched a really kind of suicidal assault on the Moncada barracks in far eastern Cuba on the 26th of July, 1953. Almost 97% of the men who were with him were members of the Orthodox Party. They were members of the Orthodox youth, and he had recruited them personally.
There were about 130 of them. Armed with shotguns and old rifles, they attacked Batista's army. Within a few hours, the Batista regime arrested, tortured, and executed around 60 of them.
Frankly, most of us who are historians of this moment and have looked at it carefully believe that Fidel thought that the majority of them would die. And he didn't lie about that to them. They understood that they were likely to be martyrs. And this idea was not offensive to them. It wasn't scary. It was something they had grown up with as a legitimate thing, to die for the nation, to die for democratic change.
Fidel Castro was also arrested. He led his own defense in court, using the trial to amplify his case against the dictatorship.
People weren't thinking about him, and he once again took the stage by publishing a longer form of the defense, the self-defense speech that he gave when he was tried for the events and the assault at Moncada. And that began to give him credibility and traction. So what was it that Fidel learned in that process? He learned that if you can control the narrative about what is happening, you are the star.
Fidel Castro was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but 2 years later he benefited from an amnesty granted by Batista. He went into exile in Mexico. There he founded a revolutionary group called the 26th of July Movement, named after that failed attack. He also met two men who would be key to his plans. One was Ernesto Guevara, later known as Che, an Argentine Marxist doctor who traveled Latin America and was determined to put an end to inequality and injustice. The other was Camilo Cienfuegos, an opponent of Batista, but by no means a communist. He would later become one of Cuba's most popular guerrilla commanders. The group sought support and money from other exiles to organize Castro's next coup against Batista. They bought weapons and they bought a yacht for 50,000 pesos from an American couple who had abandoned it in Mexico after they'd been robbed. The owners, an elderly couple, had christened the yacht Grandma. That later became the name of the newspaper published by the Central Committee of the Cuban Communist Party, Grandma. The Grandma became a symbol of the regime, even though its mission was a failure. On November 25, 1956, 82 guerrilla fighters led by Fidel Castro, his brother Raul Castro, Che Guevara, and Camilo Cienfuegos set sail for Cuba. The voyage took 2 days longer than planned. When they arrived, the Grandma ran aground off the coast, forcing the rebels to disembark with basically the clothes on their backs. They had to leave a lot of their ammunition and medical supplies behind. 3 days later, they were ambushed by Batista's army. Only about 20 of the men survived, including Fidel Castro and his closest men. They went into hiding in the nearby Sierra Maestra mountains. At the same time, in Cuba's second biggest city, the leader of the urban resistance, Frank Pais, was commanding a parallel mission to support Castro. It also failed. The regime put down that revolt with brutal force. They even executed teenagers. The regime was so merciless that in January 1957, crowds of Cuban mothers took to the streets against the repression. But Castro made up for the rebels' military defeats with a media victory. Castro was about to become the main face of the Cuban Revolution. In February 1957, journalist Herbert Matthews published a high-profile interview with Fidel Castro in the New York Times. The interview was followed by several illustrated articles in which Castro appeared as a charismatic rebel leader.
Somehow, the US press, especially the center-left media, ends up doing a fantastic PR job for Castro in the lead-up to the revolution. The American media sort of turns him into a pop icon, like a revolutionary, exotic version of Elvis Presley, but with a utopian twist. They even compare him to George Washington.
The New York Times article was soon followed by others.
It didn't stop with just Herbert Matthews' interview, which showed these idyllic guerrillas in almost picture-perfect scenes. Remember the images: people laughing, Che Guevara looking like a movie star, Fidel Castro hanging out with his friends. That idealized image of a people in revolution kick-started a major wave of propaganda that went hand in hand with the messaging the rebel radio station was broadcasting from the Sierra Maestra to Cuba and across Latin America about the Cuban Revolution.
When they do survive and make it into the mountains and they get the Herbert Matthews interview, and then they get Andrew St. George visiting them and taking photographs, and a lot of dozens of other journalists that Andrew took to the Sierra, when all of that happens, you know, Fidel was firmly anchored in this belief that if you had the publicity, if you had the stage, and if you could control the narrative, then you could control events, because people would support you. And you were not one person, you were not even 100, you weren't 1,000. You could be millions strong.
Over the next months, the rebels' popularity grew. and so did their strength. The urban underground sent them more supplies and more fighters. But on July the 30th, 1957, urban rebel leader Frank Pais was gunned down by Batista's police in the middle of the street. His mass funeral would go down in history as a turning point of the revolution. Now, at that time, Fidel Castro insisted that the 26th of July movement was a left-wing nationalist organization, but that it was democratic, not communist. I have never been, nor am I, a communist. If I were, I would have enough courage to proclaim it. A little while later, under the Pact of Caracas, Cuba's main opposition groups, led by the 26th of July movement, agreed on a united plan to overthrow Batista, appoint Judge Manuel Urrutia as interim president, reinstate the 1940 Constitution, and hold elections within a year. At the same time, Batista was losing support abroad. His regime's violence and repression drew international criticism. And in March 1958, US President Eisenhower imposed an arms embargo on Cuba. That year, Castro's guerrilla forces grew until they were a small army with several hundred fighters. They started expanding their offensives beyond the Sierra Maestra Mountains. And then, unexpectedly, Batista's army crumbled. On December the 31st, 1958, Che Guevara took Santa Clara, opening the road to Havana for the guerrillas. A few hours later, Fulgencio Batista left Cuba on a plane to the Dominican Republic, taking tens of millions of dollars with him.
Fidel, meanwhile, is doing his march from Santiago to Havana in this kind of joyful parade. There is a mobilization of forces, civilian forces, around the notion, very much promoted by the 26th of July, that we can't allow the war criminals to get away with it. And so the model for trying and executing what were called war criminals, Batista's officials who were in charge of torture, were the Nuremberg trials, based on the idea that simply because you were acting under orders, that did not release you from the responsibility for what were clearly inhumane and immoral actions.
Batista and his top generals were now out of the rebels' reach. So the rebels and many others directed their anger at those who couldn't leave: police officers, military personnel, and regime officials. Some of those they punished were genuine collaborators, but increasingly innocent people also became targets. Later on, those who disagreed with the new revolutionary government would also pay the price. Part 2: Repression in Reverse.
This is one of the collective shames of Cuba's history. The people demanded that any figure the revolutionary authorities put in front of them be sent to the wall and shot, because there was such absolute confidence in those early days in the triumph of the rebels, the mythical bearded fighters, that the people said, "Shoot them, shoot them, shoot them." And there were real atrocities committed. They were all in the media, even on television, because the trials were broadcast on television.
As news began to spread that the revolutionary tribunals were sentencing people to death without due process, often in courts led by individuals with no legal training whatsoever, criticism started to emerge abroad, especially in the United States, but also within Cuba itself, though mostly from smaller sectors. Naturally, judges, bar associations, and anyone connected to the legal profession found such a practice, carried out without any legal guarantees, intolerable. The church also responded by protesting, but among the general population there was no widespread outcry.
Anger over the horrors of the Batista regime and the promises of a new order blinded many.
That first round, we can say, first 6 months of the revolution were also the most democratic. They were the most economically feasible. It was a period in 1959 of the greatest prosperity that Cuba had in the entire 20th century.
In January 1959, Fidel Castro became the leader of the armed forces. He said that he had no ambitions of holding political office, but the next month he used his popularity to force out the prime minister and take his place. As the head of the government, he continued to deny any links to communism.
I am not communism. I am not agree with communism. And when we took the power, which were our systems? Free press to everybody, free ideas, free religion belief, and all those rights, those human rights.
But the elections he promised never happened. He was looking more and more like a dictator. Our slogan is very clear: let there be elections. But let there be elections when there is not a single unemployed person left in our homeland. Let there be elections when there is not a single Cuban who doesn't know how to read or write. Let there be elections when there is a bed and a doctor and medicines for every Cuban who gets sick. Let there be elections when the peasants have their lands. Some critical voices began to suspect Castro's motivations. President Manuel Urrutia spoke of a communist infiltration campaign in the government. Castro's reaction was to force him to resign.
By the end of '59, Fidel was relying on crowds to chant and shout a word that meant "to the execution wall" in order to intimidate his opponents and especially his critics within his own movement.
Castro's critics faced exile, prison, or a firing squad. President Manuel Urrutia chose exile, fleeing to the United States. Among the revolutionary leaders, one of the first to fall out of Castro's favor was Commander Huber Matos, military chief of Camagüey, who had protested against the appointment of more and more communists to public office. Camilo Cienfuegos was sent to arrest him.
And they had a conversation in which Huber Matos alerts Camilo that he is going to be next if it continues, right? The insertion of communists into the revolutionary political power could also affect him and others, even though they saw the revolution as a totally democratic process.
After Huber Matos' arrest, Camilo Cienfuegos disappeared.
It's a death that has yet to be documented. He was the only figure that really overshadowed Fidel Castro, because people followed Camilo Cienfuegos more than Fidel Castro. He was a more popular leader. He was a more loved leader with his huge hat. He was a person with much more charisma than Fidel. And he had the misfortune of also being a personal enemy of Raúl Castro's. All the theories about his demise indicate that Fidel took advantage of that rivalry between the two, between his brother and Commander Camilo Cienfuegos, to eliminate his power.
The United States had immediately recognized the Castro government and even looked the other way when they started taking property from U.S. companies. But within a year after the revolution, Washington began to distrust Castro. The real breaking point came when a French cargo ship called La Coubre, carrying weapons and ammo for the Cuban army, mysteriously exploded in the port of Havana.
The following day, during the burial of the victims, Castro directly accuses the United States of being behind the explosion and says the incident is actually an act of sabotage by the US government. And he does so, of course, without presenting any evidence whatsoever. To this day, we really don't know what caused the explosion.
Things escalated fast. When Cuba started buying oil from the Soviet Union, US oil companies in Cuba refused to refine it. In response, Castro nationalized those companies. Washington fired back by cutting Cuba's sugar quota, slashing around 700,000 tons from what the US usually bought. That hit Cuba's economy hard. But Castro doubled down. He seized even more US-owned property. And in response, the US imposed what would become the longest trade embargo in modern history, an embargo that still affects Cuba's economy to this day. By April 1961, there were still no elections. Encouraged by communists like his brother Raúl Castro, Fidel Castro finally acknowledged the undeniable. That is what they cannot forgive us, that we are there under their noses, and that we have made a socialist revolution under the very noses of the United States.
The Peter of the Cuban Revolution denied communism 3 times, just as Peter denied Jesus Christ. He denied it first in that interview he gave to Herbert Matthews. He denied it later on April 19, 1959, when he was invited to the United States in Washington. He gave his famous speech when he said that the revolution was as green as the palms and that the accusations of communism were totally false. And after his return on all the television programs, he takes it upon himself to deny any communist affiliation and any communist direction of the revolution. Why? Because Cuba was a very conservative Christian nation. To be a communist in the country was very much frowned upon. It was almost like mentioning Satan. Once Fidel fully declared the revolution to be socialist, it set off down the Soviet-style path of communism.
The United States was not willing to accept that. In April 1961, around 2,000 armed and CIA-trained Cuban operatives landed at the Bay of Pigs. Their mission was to overthrow the regime, but in just 3 days, they were defeated by tens of thousands of regime soldiers. Most were either killed or captured.
The total and complete victory that Cuban forces had was overwhelming and inevitable. 400,000 or more Cubans up against less than 2,200 American-trained exiles. That resounding victory consolidated support for the Cuban government as never before. Because effectively, Fidel had been predicting this for more than a year, and then his predictions came true. The United States did invade, and they did try to take over.
This allowed the Castro regime to present itself as the David that had defeated Goliath, as a government capable of confronting and defeating the United States. Its reputation grew enormously, overseas but also inside Cuba. The Cuban regime then used what happened to imprison all the critical voices it could find, regardless of whether they had any link with the Bay of Pigs landing or with the insurgency against the regime that arose at the same time in the Escambray Mountains.
After the failed invasion at the Bay of Pigs, Cuba quickly locked into the Soviet bloc. And with fears of another U.S. invasion looming, things escalated fast, almost to the point of nuclear war. In 1962, the U.S. discovered the Soviets had secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, partly to counter American nukes in Turkey, but also to deter a second U.S. invasion. Tensions hit a boiling point. And in the middle of it all, Fidel Castro wrote to Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, urging him to launch a nuclear strike on the U.S. if American troops landed in Cuba.
And there he launches a phrase that those around him have documented many times. He says, "It doesn't matter if the island sinks into the sea as long as the revolution remains in the minds of the people."
Cubans are not informed of this, and it matters that the vast majority of Cubans would endure the missile crisis and not ever know the precipice on which Fidel put their island.
In order to keep power, in order for the Castro regime to remain in power in Cuba, he was willing for the whole planet to suffer the hell of nuclear war, which is chilling.
In the end, after 13 days of maximum tension, Khrushchev reached an agreement with U.S. President John F. Kennedy, without consulting Castro. The U.S. agreed not to invade Cuba and to withdraw its missiles from Turkey. In exchange, the USSR withdrew its missiles from Cuba and kept the pact a secret. After that, there was no turning back for Cuba. It became tied to Moscow, depending on Soviet exports and aid. Meanwhile, inside Cuba, as early as 1960, Fidel Castro's regime was keeping tabs on every village, every neighborhood, and every household through a system called the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, which is still active today.
It was a totally Machiavellian idea that he had developed years earlier, at the time when they went underground. They discovered that the Batista regime's political police were constantly searching for information among the population, but failed to obtain it because they didn't have full popular support. So they came up with the idea of placing revolutionaries in every neighborhood so that these revolutionaries would become the eyes and ears of the revolution. This way, the political police and the rest of the military and repressive forces could, at any moment, stop any attempt to attack the revolution. But it was indeed an important turning point, because it was what turned Cubans into wolves against other Cubans.
Che Guevara himself defended this whole system of spying on each other, snitching, and purging opponents during a speech at the United Nations.
Sí, hemos fusilado, fusilamos y seguiremos fusilando mientras sea necesario. Nuestra lucha es una lucha a muerte. Nosotros sabemos cuál sería el resultado de una batalla perdida, y también tienen que saber los gusanos cuál es el resultado de la batalla perdida hoy en Cuba.
But soon Che Guevara's friendship with Fidel Castro started to sour.
He was a character who not only opposed the capitalist model, but also criticized the Soviet model from very early on, from 1963.
By then, Fidel had declared, if you're not with us, you're against us. So dissent was really not possible. And Che dissented. So I think to end the point and the exploration of Che's evolving image, when he left, again, people sort of pushed him aside.
That falling out was one of the reasons Che Guevara ended up leaving Cuba and starting guerrilla movements in Congo and later in Bolivia.
This image of him emerges as someone brave, fearless, who stands up to authority, who's willing to sacrifice his comfort, even his life, to travel thousands of miles to bring justice and welfare to other countries. And not only once, not only in Cuba, but in Congo and in Bolivia. Add to that Che Guevara's handsomeness and how charming he was in interviews with journalists. Honestly, in this case, I'd say he was like a revolutionary James Bond.
And even though he'd broken ties with Che Guevara, Fidel Castro still figured out how to take advantage of his popularity. After Che Guevara was killed while fighting in Bolivia, Castro got a hold of his diaries, knowing they'd make excellent propaganda.
Journalist Andrew St. George, another one from Magnum, were on site to try to get the diaries and publish the diaries in a consortium of publishing houses in the United States. My theory is that Fidel paid a member of the high command for the diaries and paid him more than the consortium was promising. So by the time you roll into the summer of '68, the diaries are released for free. And globally, all over the world. And in Cuba, it was printed in 1 million copies. So hundreds of thousands of these copies. It was required reading in Cuban middle schools and high schools from 1968 forward. And it was intensely discussed in these political circles that existed in every classroom and in every school and were led by communist youth. It also was read in workplaces. So people read this, and it's a diary of horrors, and so it's ironic that I think the European fascination with Che has nothing to do with how Cubans on the ground saw him. They saw him as a victim of Fidel Castro's hubris.
With Che Guevara's diary as a tool for indoctrination and regular Cubans spying on each other, the Cuban regime had a recipe for maintaining its hold on power.
It completely changed the way the population was controlled. The system was refined with advice from Moscow and the former East Germany, to the point where it's now considered one of the most perfect repressive systems in history. That whole setup is incredibly well-oiled, and it's what allowed the revolution to survive, along with, of course, all the so-called useful idiots around the world who keep repeating that everything is the fault of the blockade, everything is the fault of the U.S., and refuse refused to acknowledge any kind of responsibility on the part of the regime.
When the whole Soviet bloc collapsed and the USSR went down, all the subsidies disappeared, and so did the market Cuba had been relying on. That basically caused the entire Cuban economy to fall apart. In just 3 or 4 years, they lost something like 35% of their GDP. That's insane. Not even during a war do you usually see something like that, and definitely not in peacetime. It was unheard of, and it pushed the entire Cuban economy into pure survival mode.
Part 3. Captives Without Hope. The most beautiful land human eyes have ever seen, as Columbus once called it, was turned by the Cuban regime into a country with almost no industry and barely any economic activity. In today's Cuba, people face shortages of basic food and medicine. They also deal with constant blackouts, some lasting more than 24 hours.
It's a completely closed system where the state takes care of everyone. And you can't do anything unless the state allows it.
Cuban people have never been so desperate that we now have up to 23%, 27% of the population fleeing the island in the last 2 years alone. Never in the history of the revolution have we had so many in such a short period of time.
Fidel Castro, the revolutionary who came to power in 1959 promising democracy and free elections, died without ever delivering on those promises. He died on November 25th, 2016, exactly 60 years after the Grand Mas set sail for Cuba, his second attempt to take power. During his trial for the first attempt, the Moncada barracks attack, Castro famously said, "History will absolve me." So what do you think? Has history absolved him?